Hi, I'm Kathleen Carlson. Welcome to Vocal Medicine. Today I'm talking about the connection between color and sound. Is there a connection? Can that connection be used for healing? Are there colors associated with mantras? And therefore, can both of those be used together for a healing purpose? So as you may realize, this channel is both about sacred symbols and about mantras. It would be smarter from a YouTube algorithm perspective if I focused on one of those, but for me, they are one and the same. So color is simply a different manifestation of sound, and form is also a manifestation of sound. I remember going to a lecture many years ago from a woman who was shot in the line of duty. She was a police officer, and she had a near-death experience. And the most fascinating thing to me about her entire talk was that she said when she was on the other side, as she went through the tunnel and got to the other side, she saw music and sound, incredible, beautiful kaleidoscope of music and sound that were one and the same, that could not be separated from each other. And I thought, well, that's what I'm interested in terms of trying to create something here on Earth. So a lot of what I'll be talking about is from my thesis, The Color-Music Connection, which was written, that was probably 20 years ago when I was in graduate school. I'll go through and cover topic by topic, and I'll have the information here, to remind me of some of the things that are interesting to talk about. So I'll read a little bit, and then I'll fill in and talk about some of my own experiences and other information that's pertinent as well. This topic, when I wrote this thesis years ago, so it was 2001, so almost 25 years ago. It was very difficult to get information then. I had to go to the library and I would get interlibrary loan books, and then I Xeroxed hundreds and hundreds of pages because there aren't a lot of people who have really devoted themselves to this or had at that point. It actually is a growing field. There are a lot more people who are studying things like synesthesia, which is people who are born with a connection between color and sound. So when they hear a sound, they see a color in their mind. Or even reading, when they see a particular letter, there's a color associated with it. And it does tend to be something that happens in families. So anyway, there's more research being done. We'll talk about that a little more later. Than there was, 20 or 25 years ago. And I had binders and binders of information, and I had books sent to me from, I wouldn't say all over the world, but all over the country for sure. So this is the introduction and the background to this topic. The experiences of color and music in the Western world have always been closely intertwined. From the days of the ancient Greeks through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, both color and music were widely considered to possess inherent moral powers to influence their viewers and listeners for better or worse. So this is where you get into the spiritual nature of music. Are certain kinds of music bad? Do they drive the energy in the opposite direction that you're looking for in terms of the chakras? Are certain rhythms inherent in life and therefore life-affirming, whereas other rhythms are not life-affirming or even affirming the opposite, that are deadly. You can be killed with sound, like your heart can be stopped with sound if it's a certain frequency at a certain decibel or a certain strength. At any rate, back to this. Even during the Age of Enlightenment and in contemporary times, many mystics and followers of occult traditions have insisted that particular colors and types of music, especially synchronized combinations of the two arts, possess the ability to induce trances and hypnotic states. Recent studies of epilepsy actually concur that some types of seizures can be triggered by the color and sound patterns of video games and animated cartoons. In the modern world of ubiquitous multimedia productions, an examination of the possible association between color and music has become increasingly significant. Now, this is particularly true if you have heard of the Pokémon incident, which was a sequence in the very, very successful Pokémon cartoon series that had a series of blue and red flashes, and I think it was 796 children in Japan who saw this, who ended up being hospitalized or being taken to the hospital for seizures. And then when they showed the clip on the news that night, because it was this phenomena that all these children had gone into seizures watching the sequence, there were additional people who went into seizure watching the segment on the news. So that was a very big deal. They pulled that particular cartoon off the market and did extensive investigation. And indeed, it was a series. The timing and the colors and the flashing of the light just happened to be perfect or imperfect for causing seizures, so for causing light-sensitive seizures. And therefore, the idea that people with photosensitive epilepsy, or who might have it, playing video games could be a problem for them. And so it is definitely pertinent to the modern world. The question then is there really a connection between color and music? And if so, what is the nature of the connection between those two arts? So is this connection just philosophical? Is it aesthetic? Or is there a scientific connection? What if philosophers, creative artists, and scientists themselves had to say on the subject? Are experiences of a color-music connection part of a measurable, objective reality, or part of the subjective inner life of the observer? So years before I did the research for this particular document, this thesis, which by the way is available on my website, I think you can download it for $1 or $2 if you're interested in having the text. I saw an advertisement for a man who claimed to have a system of healing that was combining color and music. Now, keep in mind, this was probably 40 years ago. I'll give away my age here. And this is, years before I did this study. So I was already fascinated by that. I was really interested in using color and sound for healing. And so I went, and he had a pyramid with crystals, and you lay under this pyramid for a while, and then he brought you into a separate room and had a chair, like a dentist chair, and he had the whole room darkened, so there was no light at all. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And then he showed a film in front of you on a screen, and it was all of these geometric forms, like turning and spinning in space, and it was beautiful color, and he had this beautiful music with it. And so I watched the whole thing, and I thought that was pretty interesting, that was pretty cool, but I didn't have any deep impact at that time. So I invited a friend to come, and when she went through the whole process and was ready to leave, he came over to me and said, "Will you be with her for the rest of the day?" And I said, "Well, yes." And he said she had a really powerful emotional experience, like she was just sobbing seeing this. So it had really touched something deep, and there was something that, was happening with that particular film. At any rate, that was a long time ago, and I know that there are many people who are now working with systems of correlating color and sound for healing. And in particular, I'm interested in adding the mantras into that mix. So back to the color-sound connection. Ancient philosophies of the connection between color and sound. So in case you think that this is just a modern thing that came in with multimedia, it's not. It goes way, way back. Throughout history, the potential correspondence between color and sound has received repeated attention from prominent philosophers, artists, musicians, and scientists. Similarities between color and sound were clearly noted by the ancient Greeks. Some Greek theorists considered that color was synonymous with timbre, as a quality of sound itself. In the 4th century BC, Plato's friend, Archytas of Tarentum, called a new kind of musical scale chromatic. So he's the first one who invented that word for the musical scale. So if you're not a musician, the chromatic scale is on a keyboard, for example, when you would play both the white notes and the black notes. So it's the notes that are in between, which would be half a step above sharp or half a step below flat on the musical scale. So that's the chromatic scale. Since the days of the Greeks, the two arts, color and music, have shared a notably common nomenclature. In other words, the same words are used to describe sound as to describe color. So tone, pitch, intensity, volume, form, and so on. The analogous aspect of color in music that seems to have been the most convincing to the Greeks was the almost mathematical similarity in their regularly stepped scales. In other words, both color and sound could be arranged in a series of stages with equal differences between each measured step. The ratios among gradations of color would be similar to musical ratios and proportions. In his book De Sensu, Aristotle discussed in a general way a possible analogy between color and sound harmonies. Although Plato didn't believe that any attempt to discover the proportions of colors was valid, Aristotle wrote briefly of the potential success of this endeavor in his treatise On Sense and Sensible Objects. Aristotle says, "It is possible to believe that the number of colors is due to the proportion of their components, for these may be grouped in the ratio of 2 to 3, of 3 to 4, or any other musical ratio, or they may be in no expressible ratio, so that the colors are determined like musical intervals. For in this view, the colors that depend on simple ratios, like the concords or chords in music, are regarded as the most attractive, for example, purple and red, and a few others like them." So in other words, you can take different colors. Say you take 2 or 3 colors together and they are side by side. That is the same as forming a chord in music, where you're taking the first note of a scale, the third note, and the fifth note, for example. The other thing that's interesting here is that the frequencies of color are on a different scale than the frequencies of music, but yet it doesn't mean that there isn't a correspondence. You're looking at a different band or a different scale, but there still may be correspondences directly between color and sound. Pythagoras also contemplated a parallel between the musical scale and spectral colors. In fact, the word synesthesia, which I mentioned earlier, is derived from the Greek works syn, S-Y-N, which means together, and aesthesis, which means perception. Synesthesia refers to individuals who experience involuntary cross-sensory associations. The most common form is colored hearing, so you're seeing colors when you hear a sound. And other forms, as I mentioned earlier, well, they can even be touch. So when someone is touched in a certain place on their body, then the color orange appears in their mind. So it's cross-sensory. Pythagoras considered synesthesia to be the greatest philosophical gift and spiritual achievement. So that meant that throughout history, there are musicians and especially artists who have claimed to be synesthetes, which is someone who has synesthesia, because they consider it a spiritual gift. Another aspect of that is that babies up until the age of 4 months are viewed as they're all synesthetes. And this is one of the reasons why if you walk into the room and you suddenly turn on a light and there's a baby in the room, the baby will really startle. Or if you suddenly turn on music, without warning or loud, because the idea is that a baby under 4 months, they're not just hearing that sound. All of a sudden, it's an explosion of color in their mind. So all of their senses are connected. And then as we grow older, most of us, those senses start to be segregated. But in some individuals, that never happens. All right, now we'll move up from Aristotle and Plato, from the ancient Greeks, to some of the medieval and Renaissance theories of the connection between color and sound. Throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance, the music of the ancients remained an ideal. Rudolph of St. Trond, a theorist of the late 11th century, claimed that the modes of plain song, in other words, Gregorian chants, could be identified with the ancient Greek modes, and that both could be allied with particular colors. So there were Greek modes, which is a type of scale, and each of those types of scales were associated with a color. In the notational system, the Dorian mode was written in red, the Phrygian mode, so these are just names for the different types of modes or scales. The Phrygian mode is green, the Lydian mode was yellow, and the Mixolydian mode is purple. So those are very technical musical terms, but for most of us, all it means is that a certain pattern of sound was associated with a certain color. Later, in the Age of Enlightenment, the pivotal scientist Isaac Newton put forth a set of color-sound correspondences in his famous foundational book called Optics. This was originally published in 1730. Newton related the spectral colors, in other words, the visual colors, to the diatonic scale in a simple, straightforward approach. Red was equivalent to the note C, orange was paired with D, yellow with E, etc. So this is very similar to many of the systems for the colors of the chakras, that the lowest chakra, the root chakra, is red, then the sacral chakra is orange, and then all the way up through. So the colors of the rainbow, in other words. And not everyone agrees with that. You know, there are other systems. Leadbeater, for example, he had one system, and then there are other New Age mystics who see a whole different set of colors for the chakras. This is one approach, is relating a particular note with a particular color, which makes it very simple through the scale. On the other hand, the German poet and philosopher J.W. von Goethe's three-part publication Theory of Colors in 1810 attacked many of these color theories. He did not believe that color and sound could be compared. He did emphasize the psychology of vision and the allegorical and symbolic values of color. So he was connecting color more on a psychological level. And then we have modern and classical composers who are fond of relating colors to their music. So this is in a more general sense. Liszt described his dramatic intentions with phrases that include a color such as, "I need more pink here," or "this is too black," or "I want it all azure." And if you think about even the fact that we call blues, that blues is associated with music which is emphasizing the more challenging side of life, or the difficulties in life, and that's what we call blues. Beethoven is reported to have referred to B minor, a particular key signature, as the black key. Schubert is said to have likened E minor unto a maiden robed in white with a red rose bow on her breast. And Rimsky-Korsakov associated the color of sunlight with the key of C major and a strawberry red with the note of F sharp. One of the most influential scientists investigating the whole role of color and vision was a man named Miguel E. Chevreul. He lived from 1789 to 1889, so he lived 100 years. He was a brilliant chemist that changed the course of modern art with his insightful theories concerning color perception and color harmony. This is very dear to my heart. I was an artist before I was a musician. I played the piano and taught piano for years. But then I shifted into doing art for about 15 years, and then I came back and started with sacred music only. So the idea that there is a science behind the colors and music and sound is part of my own personal experience as well. So what Chevreul determined at that time in Europe, so here we're talking about, the 1800s, there was a lot of national pride in the beautiful tapestries that were made. So, every floor had to have a rug, every wall had tapestries. I guess it was before modern heating, so it was a way to make places cozy. And also just the stunning beauty of some of those rugs and some of those tapestries. So he was hired by the French government, by the king, to create the most intense possible colors for the tapestries for France, so that they could have the most beautiful. And he experimented with dyes. He was a chemist until he got the most intense dyes he could possibly get. And then he sort of reached a dead end. Like he couldn't figure out how to make it any more intense just from the chemistry. So he started experimenting with optics and discovered that placing one color next to another color would create a vibration. So he started experimenting with putting different colors next to each other and discovered that warm colors like red and orange are seen a split second before cooler colors like green and blue. So if you think that like the red and the orange colors come forward towards you and the blue ones recede, and it's creating a split second difference there. This causes a vibration to take place, and in your mind, it's creating greater intensity for each color. So I'll put up a couple slides to show you the difference. It's just astonishing. Certain colors next to each other, it's like they are creating a vibration. It's almost like you can see them move. If you think about modern art, Kenneth Nolan, for example, who created a whole series of circles within circles, among other paintings, but those are some of his. And he was such a master of color that when you look at the painting, it looks like it's vibrating. There's one that it just looks like a clarion trumpet because you see these colors just pulsing. So that was part of the work of Chevreul from way back in the 1800s. And his work was actually the scientific foundation for the Impressionists. It was the first time in modern history that science preceded art, that artists who learned about his work thought, well, if I put certain colors next to each other in my art, it'll create that vibration and that movement and that excitement. So they started placing pieces of color next to each other rather than blending all of the colors. And indeed, to this day, Impressionistic art is the most popular style of classical art. So laying those colors next to each other rather than blending them all, created movement and interest. And then moving into the modern era, there have been many scientists and philosophers, artists and musicians who have said, well, there's no connection in the physical or the scientific, but there's a very strong emotional and psychological connection between colors and sound. And for me, that is the whole kit and caboodle. Well, that's everything. It's the emotions and the psychology, to my way of thinking, that are actually deeper and stronger and harder to work with if they're going in a negative direction, and more inspiring and more healing if they're going in a positive direction than even trying to find an exact scientific correspondence. So there have been many who have created systems. Din Shah is one of them, who created a very exacting system of shining different forms of light on the physical body to correct different conditions. So it is possible to do that, and it's also possible. There have been people who have determined particular tones that are associated with particular organs. And then now, one of the things that's going on is vocal biometrics. And that means that a recording can be made of your voice, and exactly what diseases you may be prone to or that you actually have at that point can be seen in the patterns of your voice. So the pattern of your voice might indicate that there's trouble with your liver or there's trouble with your heart. And there's a lot of research being done now into vocal biometrics as a non-intrusive and actually very accurate form of diagnosis, which goes back thousands of years as well. Chinese doctors could do Oriental diagnosis by voice diagnosis. They could listen to someone speak and they could know that their spleen needed support or that they had stomach trouble or whatever because they were so trained to hear those variations in voice. How fast you speak, how slow you speak, how beautiful and lilting or gravelly or whatever. So your voice tells actually a ton about you. And that comes back to this idea that there is a connection between that sound and between your organs. And then for some practitioners, they were able to correlate that with particular colors and colored light therapy. So it all goes together. And then moving into the modern era in art and the correspondences between color and sound that were so prominent among the Impressionists, we have Kenneth Nolan, who I did mention earlier, as creating the circles within circles and that vibration through color. Nolan inherited from the Impressionists a practice of painting in series. He chose basic geometric forms as racks for color. The universality of the circle was particularly suitable for the abstract color language in Nolan's art. In his circle paintings, which numbered close to 200, Nolan successfully uses a simple arrangement of concentric circles, sometimes referred to as targets, to display his incredibly keen sense of color. For Nolan, color placement is akin to musical composition. Nolan believes that each color possesses a pitch that resonates beyond itself and affects the other adjacent colors, which in turn affect the overall palette of the composition. So in other words, not only are the colors affecting each other, because they're placed next to each other, but they're producing a sound, and that sound is affecting the other sounds and creating a composition. So you have a composition in art, the placement of colors and objects on a canvas, and then you have a composition in music. So that's another one of those terms that is used in both art and in music. Nolan believed that each color possesses a pitch. Colors, Nolan insists, can also be placed at higher and lower pitches and can be composed like chords across a spectrum. Colors can be used in conjunction with each other like major and minor chords and repeated in varying ways to create visual counterpoint. Nolan's musical analogies include harmony, dissonance, tone, and volume dynamics. Nolan's marvelous painting entitled Song from 1958 is the most obvious example of his attempt to translate musical sounds into color harmonies. In this work, a central pink circle is surrounded by a ring of red, then a concentric band of black, then red again, then deep blue, and finally a band of gray with a hazy, irregular edge. The effect is like a single brass note vibrating outwardly until the sound begins to disintegrate and fade. In Nolan's painting, Song, color has found a tight chorus of voices, and the internal harmonies are exquisitely strong. So the question then is, can looking at a particular painting, can looking at particular colors be healing in and of itself? There are a lot of studies showing that scenes of nature are particularly healing. In fact, there have been studies showing that patients who've had heart surgery, if there is a painting placed within their view at the foot of their bed that's a beautiful landscape, that their need for pain medication is decreased and their recovery time is increased. In other words, they can leave the hospital sooner than someone who doesn't have a painting at the foot of their bed or has a painting that isn't pleasant, that isn't life-affirming. The same is true if they have a window where they can look out on a scene of nature. So whether it's a representation of nature, nature itself, those things are healing, the colors and the forms. Now we'll take a quick look at the development of color music instruments. We think that this is a modern thing, but actually many researchers and anthropologists believe that the brightly colored folk costumes of many traditional peoples were a form of color music. In other words, as they danced, they would be flashing colors. So if you think about, when you have an animated cartoon and each frame, if you put them together and move them quickly, then you can see movement. So as people would spin and dance, especially around firelight or something that was sort of a regular, irregular light, that it would create a form of color music. So you'd hear the music, you'd see the dancing, you'd see the spinning and all of the colors. And that later evolved into what we now have, which is all kinds of multimedia extravaganza. But one of the earliest instruments was by a French Jesuit priest, Castel, and he created an organ in 1730 that he called the ocular harpsichord. And he created little pieces of colored glass. I think his first one had 90 different colors of glass, and it isn't clear how he correlated that color with a particular tone, but each note on the keyboard not only would strike a string for a particular note, but it would also pull a pulley and it would remove a curtain and show a particular color. So as you watch the instrument, as he played, you would see the colors shown. But what he created, he expanded into 500 different pieces of glass, and now he had candles behind each piece of glass, so that when the little curtain was lifted, when you struck a particular note, then the candle was shining through the light, so it was creating a light show. And unfortunately, at one point, one of the curtains caught fire, and it was a disaster. So the full development of that kind of an instrument had to wait until, number one, electricity, and number two, multimedia. And these things can be used for healing, which is in particular my interest, which is why this channel is Vocal Medicine, and the healing of color and symbols as well as music. There was a man named Cecil Stokes who was creating some of the early films, right after the Second World War. So Fantasia, which of course is the first prominent film that was just cartoon kind of things, animation, and sound that was like intimately timed, some of it abstract, some of it very concrete, and was very successful. So Cecil Stokes created something that were called the Aurora Tone films. And when there were soldiers coming back from World War II that had been injured and who were dealing with deep psychological issues and the adjustment to living life blind or living life missing limbs, that kind of thing, and had not been able to reintegrate in society, so we're in hospitals and in mental institutions, he created films that were just beautiful, abstract, kind of color in motion. And then Bing Crosby actually was a singer on one of those films. So it was this beautiful sort of nostalgic music and these moving colors. Well, of course, no one had seen anything like this because it was a very new technology. And there was something about that connection between the color and the sound that was able to break through the barrier for some of these men. So Cecil showed his films and the men would break down and cry. Men who hadn't been reached by, that had put up a barricade and hadn't been reached by traditional psychotherapy. And then they would be more amenable to working through the issues and regaining their strength to re-enter society. So that was a very therapeutic use of color and sound together. And another thing is that projecting into the future, even some of the artists and musicians who are working towards creating these kind of almost light shows, but a little more than that, they also could foresee, because we were entering by the 60s into the era of space travel, and the expectation was that we'd be going to other planets and solar systems within a few decades, and things always take longer than you think they're going to. But they were already looking ahead and thinking that if we could create light shows that could be shown to people who had not seen nature in a very long time, that this would be a comfort for them. This would replace something for them so that they wouldn't just be surrounded by metal, for example. There would be something softer, something that had movement to it, something that had color to it. So there were developing films that could be used in that kind of situation. And there is a principle that a regular irregularity is very comforting for the brain. In other words, when you have a tree and the wind is blowing through it and the leaves are moving, but they're only moving within certain parameters because they're attached to a branch, that creates an irregularity because the wind is taking them in slightly different directions, but yet there's still regularity within it. So these kind of scientific principles were the kind of things that artists and musicians were working with to develop a film that would be life-affirming and that would help the brains, help the emotions, help the moods of someone who was separated for a long period of time from the natural world and from the kind of influences that we're used to and that are soothing and healing for ourselves. So that is something that I personally look forward to integrating. Mantras are perfect for that kind of thing. When you are taking a mantra and you're repeating it over and over, every time you sing it, it's a little bit irregular. So for example, if I'm recording a piece, there's two different approaches. Well, there's many, but two approaches to this particular issue. And that is that I could sing 5 minutes of the mantra. But if I want an hour-long version of this, those 5 minutes could just be copied over, and then you would have that same 5-minute sequence 12 times. Another approach is to sing the entire thing, which is going to leave imperfections in it, but will include more of the regular irregularity, because every time you sing a mantra, there will be slight differences. There will be slight emphasis on one word or another, slight differences in volume, slight differences in rhythm, And that regular irregularity is built right into the practice of mantras. But when you're singing in a room with people, you could sing the same mantra 1,000 times, and it's always going to be different. There will be different people who are singing. Each person in the room has their own variation, and that is part of the aliveness of mantras. That's part of the practice of kirtan, is that it's okay for it not to be perfect, because that is just part of the process. Thank you for listening. Have a beautiful day. Namaste.